The Dry Salvages is the third quartet in the four quartets. And this poem is somewhat confusing in the midst of things, whereas we had in Burnt Norton and in East Coker questions, but from a place in which the poet seems to assume that there are answers. Whether or not those answers are going to remain mysterious, there will be answers. In this poem, we feel as though the old Eliot is back. And what I mean by that is you hear in these opening lines echoes of Eliot's The Wasteland from his pre-1927 conversion. Here, I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable. And we look a little bit further down, we start to get a hint of what's going on. Unhonored, unpropitiated. Look at all of this undoing he's doing. What a horrible sound to repeat over and over and over again. And the way he's playing with forgotten. So we have this almost clanging bell sound at the opening. Unhonored, unpropitiated by worshipers of the machine, but waiting, watching and waiting. His rhythm was present in the nursery bedroom, in the rank alinthus of the April dooryard. Wait a second, April. That should sound like The Wasteland. It should sound very much April is the cruelest month. And of course, The Wasteland was a desolate poem with not many answers, and the answers are all empty. They are answers of nothingness. Here we have this quartet embodying water, embodying forth water. The river is within us. The sea is all about us. The sea is the land's edge, the granite. We again have the repeat of voices from the past. The sea has voices, many gods and many voices. The salt is on the briar rose, repetition of our movement of rose here. The sea, the different voices, measuring our time, swelling, and the clanging of the bell, as I mentioned, with almost sounds like this movement of the clanging of a bell. It's not the beautiful music of a bell, but almost the way of marking the passage of time, the clanging of passage of time, calling us to different things and not knowing necessarily what it's calling us to, right? Not being able to hear the music of the bell. The sound of the clanging of the bell continues in the next movement of the third quartet. We still have the sound, you're gonna get tired of this. Okay, so I'm gonna stop. But you have this almost this really tormenting sound, and you don't know why it's ringing. Well, I shouldn't say ringing. Ringing is a more beautiful sound than the unsound. Here, it's the enging, it's the clanging, it's the agony of that sound. Time, the destroyer, is time, the preserver. Right? It's the loss of time is also the living of time, but it's moving towards death every moment. So this is the negative way of looking at time passing. It's the undoing, it's the fallen way of seeing things, like the river with its cargo of dead Negroes, cows, and chicken coops, the bitter apple and the bite in the apple. Makes me wonder if he's thinking about the 1925 floods that overtook the South. You have to remember that Eliot was from St. Louis, Missouri, so he probably, the news of the great floods all over the South that destroyed so much might be in his mind. But just the loss, the way that the water can be a destroyer, the way that time can be a destroyer, and yet also a preserver, right? Water preserves us, but it also is dangerous and also can destroy. And then this strange questioning in the middle of the poem, I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant, among other things, or one way of putting the same thing, that the future is a faded song, a royal rose, or a lavender spray. We have a repeat of the rose taking on a different significance here. The royal rose, this idea of a political meaning of the rose, the mention of Krishna. So Eliot does enjoy drawing truth from other religions outside of the Christian religion that he adhered to. So he draws on like the lotus rose early on in Burnt Norton. We have the Buddhist reality in the pool, staring at oneself in the pool in Burnt Norton. So he was not afraid of drawing from pagan. And look at Heraclitus as the epigraph. So finding all truth, being God's truth, a very Augustinian notion that you take from the Egyptians, what is gold and what is true, what is worthwhile, and be able to baptize it or understand it via a Christian lens. Something is happening a little bit different here in doubting Krishna and finding Krishna confusing. It's not the author of Dry Salvages finding truth in Krishna. It's the Wasteland author pointing out the confusion that comes from some of these other ways of thinking, right? I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant. Even the verbosity of that sentence leads us astray in that way of thinking, and among other things, or one way of putting the same thing. So we have some confusion in the Wasteland, and I think that's what is meant by the Dry Salvages. I think it is as we move through Burnt Norton, entering into our first world, and then we have the move that takes place in East Coker, looking back at the world that came before us, at our ancestral world. And then we now have Dry Salvages, the world we currently inhabit, the world that is supposed to be our new world, our new frontier, and yet we are worshiping a brown river god that we don't understand, that is both a destroyer and preserver. Of course, that should sound very Hindu. And we don't know what Krishna meant, and we don't know how to account for certain things, and we don't know the way that all of this comes together. And that's what's happening in Dry Salvages, it's the negative movement in the quartets. Is looking at the Wasteland, and he's still asking similar questions to what he's asked in the first two quartets, but he's asking them without a lot of hope for the answer. And this is not the author not having hope for the answer. This, of course, is a representation of the age that we're in which we lack these answers. The poet writes, to communicate with Mars, converse with spirits, report the behavior of the sea monster, describe the horoscope. He's talking about all the places we go to seek our answers to these questions and not being able to find them. To explore the womb or tomb or dreams, these are all usual pastimes and drugs and features of the press. What we have is just unvalidated sources of information, ways of answering our curiosity of trying to understand. And he contrasts that briefly with a few moments in this movement, in the fifth movement, that point to what we'll see in Little Gidding. But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation of the saint. The contrast between the wasteland and the saint's occupation here is stark. But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless, right? The kairos with time, with the chronos, is the occupation of the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death and love, ardor and selflessness and self-surrender. So not an occupation in the sense of we choose the job, but that the revelation of how the timeless, the kairos, touches the chronos. It is a lifetime of both receiving those revelations, being given them and giving them out in self-surrender. In opposition to what we just saw with people trying to communicate with Mars and conversing with spirits and exploring the womb and pastimes and drugs and barbiturate acids, etc., dissecting these recurrent images and so forth. The loss, the distraction, right, as mentioned in Burnt Norton, distracted by distraction from distraction in that opening. that is what people are left with without the occupation of a saint. He writes, there are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood, is incarnation. Here, the impossible union of spheres of existence is actual. Here, the past and future are conquered and reconciled, where action were otherwise movement of that which is only moved and has in it no source of movement. We have the incarnation being hinted at and guessed and given by the poet in the middle of Dry Salvage, or middle, it's the end of Dry Salvages, but it's a way of pointing towards what's going to come in Little Gidding. The incarnation is the hint half guessed, the gift half understood. It's the union that is impossible and yet made possible between the divine and the human, between the kairos and the chronos. To understand the incarnation is going to help us understand some of our questions that the poet has been asking since Bert Norton.